get into this talk. But when my book was finished and almost ready for production, the University of Arkansas Press called me and they wanted me to name 3 people that could read the manuscript and write a blurb for the back of the book. And one of the people that I desperately wanted to do that was a woman named Meredith Sisko. Does that name mean anything to you all? She's a country music folk singer and a raconteur, and she's on an Ozark radio station that I know plays here about once a week, and just a wonderful woman, several years older than I am. And I had met her a couple of times, but I had no idea if she knew who I was. So I wrote her this kind of groveling note and said, I've written this book about this woman newspaper reporter, and I didn't know if she'd ever heard of Lucile. And I said, I would really appreciate it if you could read the manuscript and write a blurb for the back of the book. You know, please let me know. Before the day was over, she wrote back. And she said, Susan, I would love to do that. She said, Betty, I wanted somebody to write about Lucile and Betty, and that was Betty Love, a photographer, about Lucile and Betty for years. They were my heroes growing up in the rural Ozarks, because my goal in life was to get out of town and make my fortune and not face the life of domesticity that my aunts and parents said that I had ahead of me in the Ozarks. And they were out there doing things, and I would love to write about them. So I would love to write about those 2 fearless female journalists. So that's why they're fearless female journalists, because Meredith told me that. So with that, aside from Meredith, when I meet people who've heard of Lucile or read her history column, which was in the paper for years, they'll say something like, she was a real pioneer, wasn't she? And after all, she began her newspaper career 101 years ago in Denver in 1923. And then she moved on to El Paso, to the El Paso Times, and then came home to the Ozarks on her way to a job in London. So she was a pioneer of sorts. But as I did the research on my book, I learned that everything Lucile did, every job she held, every place she worked, there were other women there before her, and there were other women there when she got there. And that's what I want to talk about today. I was fortunate to get to know Lucile when I was in my 20s and was working at the Springfield News Leader, excuse me, where she had been a reporter for almost 40 years, long before I was there. But she was still writing her history column, the good old days. And I remember her coming into the newsroom in those pre-internet days with her column, and she would give it to managing editor Dale Freeman. Excuse me. And sometimes she would have another article that she'd written of something she thought the newspaper had missed. And she would tell Dale he really needed to print that story because it was important. And as far as I know, Dale always printed those stories that she brought in, because Lucile was a force to be reckoned with, even in her 80s. And like I said, that's one of the reasons that her life was so intriguing to me. She was born in 1898. That's just 33 years after the end of the Civil War, in Dadeville, which was a thriving farm town just northwest of Springfield. She's always said she had a bookish family. It was also a storytelling family, and she grew up listening to stories about her mother's uncle, who was killed in the Battle of Wilson's Creek, just west of Springfield, and stories about the Baldknobbers, who were fierce vigilantes who terrorized the Missouri Ozarks in the years right after the Civil War, and stories about Daniel Boone's son, Nathan, who was a surveyor, a salt producer, a peacemaker on the western frontier, a member of Missouri's first state legislature, and whose big home was crumbling away, not far away in the village of Ash Grove, Missouri. Lucile always said that those stories were responsible for her lifelong interest in Ozarks history and her passion for preserving historic sites. She grew up in her little house on the corner of her Morris grandparents' farm, and her father died when she was 9, and I suspect that's about when that picture was taken. She's there with her 2 little brothers and her mother, who never remarried. So she grew up knowing that she was going to have to take care of herself. I planned to become a teacher, she said. It was the only career I knew. Well, when she was 19, she did become a teacher in her hometown school. And there, not surprisingly, she fell in love with another teacher. His name was Homer Garland, And he told her that his goal in life was to save his money, go west, and become a newspaper reporter. They taught together for a year. Then Garland left for World War I, and he ended up not going overseas. But after the war, he managed to find a job at the Tulsa Democrat. And he would come back to visit Lucile in the Ozarks, and he wrote her passionate letters from Tulsa about his love for her and about being a reporter and about the importance of newspapers in the world back in those days. Here's one of his letters, and remember, this was 100 years ago. He wrote, "Did you ever consider what would happen if we were without newspapers, even for a day? Business would be partially paralyzed, and the whole country would be as greatly upset as if there was no bread." Now, that was 100 years ago. Maybe not so important today. But other times, he wasn't quite so high-minded. Here's one of those letters. He wrote to her, he said, "We're having it very dull now, insofar as big local news is concerned. A few deaths, conventions, minor accidents, and that sort of thing. But one of these days or nights, there'll be a suicide and a train wreck and a killing all at once. Then business will pick up." So he clearly knew what newspapering was about. Well, odds are it was Garland and those letters that lighted the fire in Lucile for her own journalism career. And she saved his letters, which incidentally are online through the Springfield, Missouri library system. But those letters weren't enough to keep Lucile interested in Garland. And by 1922, the two had parted ways, and Lucile was looking for an adventure. She found it in Roswell, New Mexico. Roswell was hiring teachers from the east, and she rode what was called the teacher train out west. Every time I say that or see that phrase, I think about the old Western movies and the stagecoach pulling into town with a school marm in the back, and the door opens and the handsome cowboy takes her off and they save the town. I don't think that happened to Lucile. But she did teach in Roswell for a year and mulled over her future. And by the end of the spring term, Lucile had decided to change careers. She made up her mind to attend the journalism school that had opened at the University of Missouri in 1906, and that's the first graduating class. And she may have even known that there was a woman in that first class. Her name was Mary Beth Paxton. So Lucile hitched a ride home from a friend who had an automobile, and on the way, they took a side trip to Denver. And in Denver, the friend went sightseeing, and Lucile decided to take a chance and applied for a job at the Denver Post. Now, the Post had nothing against hiring women, but it had nothing available. And the editor suggested that she try the much smaller Denver Express across town. So she went to the Express office and asked if they would hire her, despite the fact that she had no experience and had not been to journalism school. And the editor said, "Good, I like to train my own people." And he hired her on the spot. And they had an opening, and he hired her on the spot. So that was the beginning. And as I said earlier, it was 101 years ago in the summer of 1923. And incidentally, that was the same year that Roberta Fulbright took over the Fayetteville Daily Democrat and the death of her husband. She ran it with the help of a woman city editor until 1953. Now, Lucile began her career at the Denver Express as the lowest of the low, as far as newspaper jobs are concerned. She was a sob sister, and she wrote the Advice to the Lovelorn column. So let me digress a bit and tell you about sob sisters. I've always heard the phrase, but I didn't know this before. In 1907, there was a wealthy New York playboy named Harry Thaw who killed an architect named Sanford White over the reputation of his chorus girl wife. And you can imagine, Thaw's trial was sensational and long-running. Dozens and dozens of reporters from all over the country, including 4 women, were there through the entire trial. And these 4 women pulled out all the emotional stops when they wrote their articles. And before the trial was over, the 4 women were making the news themselves with their heart-rending reports of this story. And those tear-jerking, poignant articles earned them the name Sob Sisters. And the name grew to refer to any female reporters who covered emotional subjects in an emotional way. Think widows and orphans. But also remember that a lot of those stories caused social change to happen. Anyway, one of the 4, Dorothy Dix, oh, there's the trial. I'm sorry, I'm behind. There's Dorothy Dix, had already penned the first newspaper advice column, and that was quickly copied all over the country. Another of the women was Winifred Black Bonfils, and she was known also as a girl stunt reporter, another title that was given to many newspaper women in those years. Bonfils made a name for herself when she staged a fainting spell on the streets of San Francisco, not too long after the San Francisco earthquake, in order to write an expose of San Francisco's emergency hospital. And she later worked for the Denver Post. Anyway, Lucile's assignment to author an Advice to the Lovelorn column and write weepy human interest stories was where many other newspaper women started. At the Express, she dispensed advice under the name Cynthia Gray. She fielded questions from young women about whether to quit their jobs when they married, what to do about unfaithful husbands and boyfriends, and how to pick a career. And if you look at the old newspapers, there was even an occasional recipe thrown in. And one time I found a little comment that she said that somebody had some free puppies, and if anybody wanted a puppy, that this was the place to go get them. Anyway, as the year progressed, Lucile's answers became less conservative, and her advice to the young women was much more pointed. She told them to become independent and make their own decisions about their futures, which probably reflected her own growing independence and sense of individualism. But she wasn't Cynthia Gray all the time. From the beginning, the Express sent Lucile to cover a variety of other stories, mostly small ones. And that's when she fell in love with newspapering. And then, one Sunday morning, the editor looked around the newsroom and called her over. "President Harding's in town," he said. "Go find out what's going on." Not a bad step up for a sob sister. Well, that assignment to write about President and Mrs. Harding's visit to Denver remained a highlight of Lucile's career. As she said, "I never have been, before or since, never have felt so proud as I did that Sunday morning." And she also, I talked about the love letters. She gave a lot of talks over the years, and she wrote down every one of those speeches and kept them in little notebooks, which I've seen. So when I'm quoting her, that's really what, I don't know if it's what she said, but it's what she intended to say. It's things that, her words that she wrote down. And she talked a lot in interviews that I've seen also about having covered President Harding. Another major assignment that she had was to do with women's rights. The National Women's Party came to Colorado to push for passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, which incidentally has yet to pass. And Lucile interviewed Alice Paul, who's the woman on the left in the second picture, and she was the party founder. And she also interviewed some of the other honchos in the party. And then the other woman in the hat was named Alva Belmont, and she was a wealthy supporter of the movement. And Lucile said that she really had trouble interviewing Mrs. Belmont because Mrs. Belmont wanted to interview me, Lucile later told a group. She wanted to know if I faced discrimination in my work. I was so deliriously happy to have a newspaper job that I couldn't complain about anything. And I think she felt that way all the rest of her life. Well, when she was at the Express, Lucile did have a chance to get acquainted with other newspaper women in Denver. One of the women was Frances Wayne, an investigative reporter at the Denver Post, who incidentally also had begun as a sob sister. Lucile described Mrs. Wayne as decidedly the big shot among newspaper women. I began hearing stories about how she lorded it over the other newspaper reporters, the other women reporters. Then one day, I was sent to get an interview at the city jail. It was my first time to step inside a jail. I was supposed to interview a woman forger, and it was my first time to ever talk to a woman criminal. Close to being my first time to write any newspaper story of any importance. Well, I went on into the cell with the woman forger. I got my feeble interview, and I started back out to the jail office. To my surprise, the matron introduced me to Frances Wayne. Now, perhaps Mrs. Wayne took pity on so unsophisticated a girl reporter, or maybe she was just big-hearted. But anyway, she did many lovely things for me when I was in Denver. She and her friend Polly Pry, the other picture, who was the Post's first female reporter in 1898, sponsored me in the Women's Press Club before I really had enough experience to merit membership. Now, despite the press club activities and her new friends and her periodic opportunities to cover real news stories, after a year in Denver, Lucile became very tired of writing the Lovelorn column. She managed to find a full-time reporting job in El Paso. She quit the Denver Express, and she moved south. Those were the good old days, she said, when reporters could go from one paper to another without difficulty. That's how they moved up the ladder. Well, as in Denver, the Times staff had employed women journalists for more than a generation, and Lucile, history buff that she was, ate up what she learned about them. One of the women was Peggy Hull, who had been at the time 6 years before Lucile arrived. During World War I, Peggy talked the Times management into sending her to France with the El Paso area troops. And once she got to France, because she was not an accredited war correspondent, she couldn't actually go to the front lines. So instead she wrote what she called chatty little stories about the military men, about life in an artillery training camp, and about Paris during wartime. And those chatty little stories attracted the attention of editors across the US. And within a few months, Peggy Hull was a national celebrity. And apparently she also was thoroughly disliked by the men war correspondents because she was a national celebrity. When she returned to El Paso, she was welcomed back by a big crowd and a band. But she didn't stay long. Within a few months, she convinced her military contacts to help her become this country's first accredited war correspondent, female war correspondent. And in that capacity, she accompanied the US Army to Siberia during World War I, and later she reported from the Pacific during World War II. Meanwhile, at the Times, Lucile worked with other men and women who had literally been reporters all over the US and Europe, and were nearly all on their way someplace else, as I said. Later, she would cheer as they were nominated for Pulitzer Prizes, taught at universities, wrote novels, and edited some of the biggest newspapers in the US. One man whose name I found and followed out became the editor of the LA Times, just for one example. Another fellow who had worked with the International News Service in Europe even helped Lucile get a job in London. So she quit the El Paso Times and headed home for one last visit to the Ozarks before moving to London. But once she got home, as happens in this part of the country, one thing led to another, and she just decided to stay. First, she applied to the Kansas City Star and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And both big cities turned her down because she was a woman, in spite of her experience and in spite of the fact that they had both hired women before. One of the women was Marguerite Martin. Martin joined the St. Louis Post-Dispatch around 1900 as a staff artist, and she was a talented sketch artist, and as it turned out, very good at interviewing and writing about her subjects. She was definitely a feminist and a suffragist, as a lot of her stories and pictures show, but she was so good, and her fame was so much that she interviewed people eventually like Sarah Bernhardt and Andrew Carnegie, plus US senators and presidents William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. And from what I know of Lucile, I'm sure she was disappointed that she wasn't hired by the big city papers, but she certainly wasn't heartbroken. In 1926, she joined the Springfield Leader. And for the next 40 years, she was probably Springfield's best-known newspaper woman. Although even in Springfield, she wasn't the first. There were several newspaper women before Lucile, and recently I came across the name of one woman who'd worked at the Springfield Leader around 1900, and may or may not have been the very first, and that's her picture. Her name was Elizabeth Hyatt Gregory, and she wasn't in Springfield very long, but she later worked for other newspapers and went on to become the first woman who seriously covered aviation as a beat. She was on hand to report from the New York Sun on some of the Wright brothers' early flights and to cover Glenn Curtiss and the beginnings of the aviation industry. And in 1909, Mrs. Gregory was invited to the White House when President Howard Taft gave awards to those aviation pioneers. Now, I don't think Lucile was ever invited to the White House, but she did break barriers when she became the first woman in Springfield to cover the courts, county government, the sheriff's office, and the jail. And she also had a chance to write about aviation, although from the passenger side. In 1929, Lucile's editor sent her to ride in the Ford Air Tour, which was a 5,000-mile cross-country promotional air race. And Lucile rode in a 7-passenger plane in the race leg between St. Louis and Springfield. Coincidentally, her plane won that day's race, and there were 20,000 cheering people waiting when they landed. She said that her pilot was pleasant and friendly as we chatted before the takeoff. Now, that's not the pilot. That's a promotions person, I think. And the woman was the wife of another one of the pilots in one of the other planes. Her pilot was named Wiley Post, an aviation pioneer for sure. Just 3 years later, Lucile flew again, and this time as part of a promotion for passenger air travel. The new transcontinental and Western Airlines asked her to fly Space Available from Springfield to New York City and write about the trip. On the way, she got bumped and had to spend the night in Cincinnati, which she didn't like, and then she was delayed in Pittsburgh till 10 o'clock at night. And she loved that late-night flight to New York. "Never have I seen such a show," she wrote for the people in Springfield. "Below, miles and acres and swarms of light. I gasped to realize that all this unreal, unbelievable scene, which I watched from the skies, actually existed." By chance, on the day that Lucile was flying to New York, Amelia Earhart was flying across the U.S. to set a new woman's record on transcontinental flight. And Earhart made it in 19 hours. "Aviation is a woman's game as well as a man," Earhart told a reporter. And Lucile would, of course, said the same thing about journalism. Now, some of her assignments, like the 2 airline flights, were just plain fun. Others were the stuff of thrillers, like those that came out of her much-loved courthouse run. She delighted in the drama and being in on the action at the courthouse, and she thoroughly enjoyed being the first woman in a man's world. "I never will forget the expression on the face of the sheriff and his deputies when I first walked into that office," she said. "The sheriff's office was a favorite loafing place for men, and it took them considerable time to get used to a woman popping in the office every little while." Eventually, the sheriff accepted her, but in the first weeks of her courthouse run, she made a misstep. As she told it, she was watching out a window as 2 deputies marched a half-dozen prisoners from the jail to the dental clinic in the courthouse. Just as they got to the front steps, one of the prisoners broke and ran, she said, and as he crossed the street, a deputy shot him. Now, Lucile's instincts were good, but her experience was limited. She rushed to a telephone and called the newsroom. When the editor answered, she said, "I've just seen a man killed. Send a reporter." Apparently, it took her quite a while to live that down. But a year later, she wasn't daunted when word came that the sheriff and 5 deputies had all been shot to death at a farm west of town. It became known as the Young Brothers Massacre, and that was the worst police killing of the 20th century, right up until 9/11. And of course, it was a national news story. And Lucile was in the middle of that coverage. As I said, she wasn't the only woman reporter in Springfield. Here she is about the time of the Young Brothers Massacre with her friend Dosha Carroll on the left and Beth Campbell on the right. Not long after this picture was taken, Campbell married and moved to Washington, D.C., and there she went to work for the Associated Press, and she covered press conferences in the White House that were held by Eleanor Roosevelt exclusively for women journalists. Carroll eventually went to Japan as an editor with the U.S. Army of Occupation after World War II, and then she spent the bulk of her career as an editor for Japan Airlines magazine. So these women were really doing stuff. Lucile, on the other hand, stayed at the paper until 1936, and that year, everything changed for her. She married Eugene Upton, a Greene County Circuit Court reporter, obviously the man in the white suit. He was a widower with 2 sons in the military and a daughter in high school. And as was the custom in those years, Lucile left the newspaper when she married, but she didn't stop working. During her time off, her long years of interview and research about those vigilantes who had terrorized the Missouri Ozarks in the 1880s resulted in publication of a well-received book called The Bald Knobbers. Then, only a few weeks after Pearl Harbor, she was having coffee with a group of news people, and the managing editor, George Olds, who was short of staff because of the war, asked her to come back to work. She turned him down, but he persisted. "Isn't there something you could do?" he said. Well, the result was her newspaper column, all about Ozarks history. She described it as an antidote to war. The Good Old Days column looked back at the news 50 years before. It ran as a part of the Sunday newspaper for more than 40 years and became a must-read for anyone who cared about Springfield or regional history. But even as Lucile was producing what she called her antidote to war, a St. Louis woman, Virginia Irwin, was in the thick of it as a reporter for the Post-Dispatch. Thanks in part to the ground laid by Peggy Hull, Irwin was one of the first correspondents into Berlin, and this photo of her with the headline, "She Got to Berlin," was featured in the Post on VE Day in 1945. During the war years, Lucile also continued to write and speak about the need to save her 2 favorite preservation projects, the Wilson's Creek Civil War Battlefield and the Nathan Boone Home, Both eventually were saved. Wilson's Creek is part of the National Park Service, and the Nathan Boone home is a Missouri State Historic Site. And if you're ever up that way, I would recommend both places. They're fascinating to visit. But meanwhile, the specter of war hung over the lives of Lucile and her husband. Her brother George and her two stepsons were all serving in the Pacific. George came home unscathed, but one stepson was killed when the aircraft carrier Franklin was bombed, and the other spent the war in a Japanese prison camp. The stress, especially on Lucile's husband, was terrible. So much so that not long after the war ended, he had a massive heart attack and died. They'd been married about 11 years. And before long, as I probably don't need to say out loud, Lucile was back at the newspaper full-time. Now, not long after she rejoined the newspaper staff, the city desk began sending her out with Betty Love, one of the newspaper's prized photographers. Like Lucile, Betty began as a teacher. She majored in art at Drury College, moved to Texas, and taught art in San Antonio for a few years. Then she came back and joined the Springfield public school system as a junior high art teacher. Also like Lucile, Betty got tired of teaching, and she applied for a summer job at Springfield newspapers. And for about 3 years, she worked as an illustrator and a cartoonist, and she's in the foreground here at the left. And then she talked management into letting her become a photographer. Later, George Olds, the managing editor, wrote a rather backhanded column in praise of Betty. "Girl reporters are not new in our experience," he wrote. "Everyone knows we've boasted some wonderful ones. We've always tried to hire the best possible people as individuals, not as men or women. But somehow, it never occurred to us to have a girl photographer. In that sense, we're about as dumb as the editors who still won't hire women reporters." Well, over the next few years, Betty and her pictures became well known. She was a charter member of the virtually all-male National Press Photographers Association and one of the first inductees into the Missouri Photojournalism Hall of Fame. She was also a pioneer in color newspaper photography. But she also became known for her take-no-prisoners attitude about her work, as when she had a falling out with her friend President Harry Truman about Truman's pal, Federal Marshal Fred Canfield, and a picture that she wanted to take of a federal prisoner. Canfield told Betty that she couldn't take the picture. Then, when the reporter who was with Betty, not Lucile, pointed out that Betty had a constitutional right to take the photo, Canfield yelled, "The Constitution be damned," and threw a blanket over the prisoner. And that's the picture. Betty took the picture anyway. And that story, as you can imagine, made headlines across the country, and it reverberated throughout the journalism community, and it upset President Truman. Ultimately, it took Betty's and the president's mutual friend, the artist Thomas Hart Benton, to get them to make peace. And they both needed each other, because when Truman was in that part of Missouri, he needed Betty to take his picture, and she certainly needed to take it. But he spent a lot of time turning his head, putting his hat over his face, and not letting her take pictures. But it didn't take long after Betty and Lucile, no, wait a minute. Around 1950, Betty and Lucile began working together. And when they did, the two women were middle-aged. In 1950, Lucile was 52 and Betty was 40. But it didn't take long after they began working together that they became a hit with readers across the Ozarks. Over the next 15 years, the two women covered a variety of stories, from bank robberies and murders to Ozarks history and President Truman. As often as not, the reports about what it took for Lucile and Betty to get their story was at least as interesting as the story itself. One of their most well-known adventures had to do with an old Philibert cemetery on the edge of the James River. During the years that the two women worked together, one of the biggest political issues in this part of the world was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and their thirst for building dams, especially dams in the Ozarks. And you may remember one of the most contentious of those projects was the push to build Table Rock Lake, and in the process flood much of the bottomland along the James and the White River, including that historic little cemetery. Well, when Lucile heard about the cemetery's plight, she wangled an assignment so that she and Betty could go to do the story before it disappeared. She knew that Joseph Philibert, a French fur trader, was probably the first white settler in that part of the Ozarks, and his burial place deserved attention. On the appointed day, when they arrived at the edge of the James River across from the cemetery, it turned out that the bridge had been washed out. And so instead of making the long drive around, they took the advice of a nearby fisherman and decided to wade across the river. We'd have to wade through weeds, then go down a slippery mud bank to get to the shallow water, Lucile wrote in that week's Sunday paper. But that's exactly what we did, because Betty was determined to get her picture. Well, Lucile was equally determined. So she took off her shoes, hiked up her skirt, and headed across. Betty, of course, took a picture of Lucile in the river. You see. Then she took off her shoes, rolled up her pants legs, and followed. The two women were dripping wet when they took notes on and pictures of the 22 little graves. So when they made ready to step into the river again, they weren't nearly as enthusiastic as they had been on the other side. Then, as Lucile wrote, just like in a movie, when rescue comes at a desperate moment, a boat came around the bend. They waved and called for help. Then also, just like in the movies, the young woman in the boat called out, "Well, you're Betty Love, aren't you?" It turned out that Betty had taken the young woman's picture several years earlier when she won a scholarship. They were saved. The two soggy women climbed in among a pile of camping gear, and their new friends ferried them across the river. Two fishermen helped them out onto the riverbank, and Betty then took a picture of the couple in the boat. And that's it, and you can see part of the picture page that was in the paper that Sunday. And their timing was excellent. A few weeks later, the Corps of Engineers moved the little cemetery to a much drier spot in Kimberling City, down by Branson. And every detail of that very damp day was described in the Sunday paper, complete with Betty's picture of Lucile, knee-deep in the river. And the newspaper public loved it, as you can imagine. Another time, when Lucile and Betty were at a party, the city desk called to send them to cover a bank robbery in Republic, a little town west of Springfield. And later, a mutual friend who was at the party told me that as they left, Lucile said, "Well, we may get shot, but we're off." As an aside, they said that they were always sent on crime stories and other iffy assignments because they were each single, and if something happened to them, it wouldn't be nearly the problem for the newspaper management as if they had families. Well, when they got to the Farmers State Bank, the police had everything under control in this case. The two actual robbers were in custody, and an extremely drunk getaway driver was handcuffed in the back seat of the police car. As Lucile spoke with the police, Betty leaned in the car with her camera. The would-be robber looked her over and then gave her a big smile. "Why, Betty," he said, "did you come to take my picture?" They were really well known. Well, the other two robbers went to jail. The fellow who recognized Betty had been so drunk that he couldn't even remember if he'd driven, never mind the bank robbery. And so he was set free. Now, many more adventures of those two fearless female journalists followed. Then on January 1st, 1964, Lucile, age 65, retired from Springfield newspapers. And when she retired, she was so well known and had been around so long that the Sunday paper carried an editorial describing her as an editor's dream of a newspaper woman, the reporter who can do everything and anything and do it well. We are delighted that Lucile will continue her Sunday column, The Good Old Days. But as you can imagine, even after her retirement, and even with the column, Lucile couldn't just sit back. A few years after she left the paper, she was elected to a term of the Springfield City Council. And there she was a voice for historic preservation and worked to right some of the wrongs that she had learned about in her years as a reporter. In her later years, she was honored many times over by civic organizations, women's organizations, the College of the Ozarks, and she was even named the official Greene County historian. Lucile also spent a lot of time later in life offering advice to young women. Basically, her message was something that she told the girls and women when she was writing that advice column for the Denver Express. She told younger women they could do anything that they wanted to. Her attitude and her advice was that women could and should make their own success. She certainly did, and so did Betty Love. And Peggy Hull and Frances Wayne and Elizabeth Gregory and Roberta Fulbright and Virginia Irwin and the rest of all those fearless female journalists that Lucile met and worked with along the way. What a journey that was. And as she said over and over, she loved being a newspaper woman. And what a gift it was to the rest of us who came afterwards. Thank you. And I'd love to answer any questions, if you've got any. Sir?
kind of off Ms. Upton, but do you know when, like UPI, AP kind of wire services, when those came along? Because you mentioned one of the gals.
Right,
One
the
of the
Associated
gals.
Press.
Yeah.
I don't know. It must have been in the late 1800s, though. As soon as, anybody else know? Because the El Paso people, that one fellow had worked for the International News Service.
Yeah.
So newspapers were important. They wanted to get the information back and forth across. Now I have to go home and find out. Anybody else? Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
I hope you like Lucile.
Did she ever speak of regret or anything about not taking the job in London? Did she ever write anything?
Not that I knew. I never heard anybody say anything about that, except that I'm sure she made a point of telling people, because people knew that, But,
But was that with like London Times or?
no, with the International News Service.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I think she's also very lucky, and even these days, I know she has courage definitely, and she struggled and faced the challenges. But even these days, women are stuck still by so many things.
Well, that's true, but even things work out for so many women, and a lot of times it'll be a man that helped them get to that next place. So,
Her case is most women also helped her. Huh?
Yeah,
Okay.
they
This
did
is
help
on
each
one
other.
side, I think women are still stuck. On the other side, I think this rising feminism. I am a feminist, but I see many other things coming because men are under pressure and they don't like us to change everything. And it's scary, it's true, if the old order changed. And many violent events happening already. And I know the Northern Europe and many men killing a woman. And Notre Dame Cathedral in France burned. I don't know who burned it. And
Yeah.
sometimes I think, okay, I don't want to be a Notre Dame somewhere. I want to be a real woman. And sometimes I think maybe people who hit women, they burn it. It's very interesting phenomenon right now. And what's the future? Yes, when women can nurture a family, can nurture the whole country. We are powerful at that country. Then what is the man's role in the future? It's true, women can do everything besides we just need a sperm, okay, to have a baby. Then we can do everything, okay? But, okay, what's the future of the man and woman balance or harmony? And the modern technology, we don't need to deliver babies. And so many things are coming, and the feminism, after this feminism, thinking, oh my goodness, I don't know, I got stuck in this theoretical exploration also.
I think this is definitely
I'm not liberated yet, but I'm already stuck in the future, this dilemma.
this is definitely a time of change. Anybody have any comments?
Do you think she considered herself a pioneer or a crusader?
I think she considered herself a pioneer, but she adamantly did not consider herself a feminist. She was very funny about that in some of the talks. She said, those fem libbers. I mean, she had done it herself, which is not true. I mean, everybody has help. But she was a role model because she was there and other women could see what she was doing. But she was not part of the feminist movement per se.
And there are many types of the feminism, some radical ones,
Right,
some
right.
conservative ones, and good ones and bad ones.
Yeah. Anybody else? Well, that's a conversation that can go on forever and ever.
Thank you for sharing this.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Oh, is there anybody here who has ever worked for a newspaper? I just want to show you one more slide that I saved because I've been waiting for somebody to be able to see it. When the Denver Women's Press Club started, this woman made up the rules, and they adopted them. and they wouldn't pick anybody who was a bore, who held out on reporters, who didn't respect the power of the press, and who didn't read your newspaper. And copy editors and proofreaders are forever barred from.
Not just a reporter, and I also worked as a copy editor.
Are you from Missouri?
I was born in California after World War II, but I grew up in St. Louis.
Because you say Missouri instead of Missouri. so-
My mom's people were all from Springfield and west of there, so I grew up with an Ozark accent.
Okay, Missouri,
Yes,
okay,
only St. Louis is where they say Missouri,
okay,
and outside of the state.
okay.